Hey, hello, my name is Rolando, and in this time I'm going to talk about the City Council challenge, which is a challenge from Hacksmarter Labs. This is an Active Directory challenge, and its difficulty is rated as medium. This is a quite long challenge, so I won't be talking about all the vulnerabilities that it contained. The reason of this video is mostly because I noticed that I need some practice when talking about security vulnerabilities. I basically need more practice at speaking. So yeah, I'm doing these videos for that reason. So for the first vulnerability, it will be the insecure services. So during the assessment, we identified a binary. It was a binary, an executable. In this binary, there was some kind of Active Directory authentication going on, and obviously this authentication wasn't going from the most proper protocol. Authentication was being handled by an insecure protocol. I was not able to confirm if that was an LDAP authentication or if it was by HTTP. So in this case, as a mitigation, I'll recommend both. Using both LDAP-S and HTTP-S for a secure authentication, because in this case, um, we as an attacker, me as an attacker, I was able to intercept that authentication and get clear text passwords. So yeah. So yes, LDAP-S and HTTP-S. The S in these protocols stands as secure. So all the communication going through those services is completely encrypted, and a threat actor would not be able to intercept that communication. Well, if they intercept that communication, the communication will be completely encrypted, so it will not be readable as for the threat actors. Also, if there is an authentication process going on, I would recommend to rely on Kerberos. This is just to rely more in a more delegated or token authentication. Avoid storing credentials and using a Windows Windows creation credential manager or the Azure Vault, to handle more safely these credentials when you need an Active Directory authentication process. So for the next vulnerability, as we can say, we have curve roasting. So curve roasting is not a vulnerability by itself; it's a functionality. Let's say, for example, when a user wants to access a service like a SQL or a web server, um, the domain controller will issue a service ticket for the access. So any authenticated domain user uh, can request these tickets to access that service. So that in fact is a normal behavior. Obviously, if curve roasting is not required, why would you have it? So disable. So then, if this is normal behavior, this could be normal behavior. Um, why is it treated like a vulnerability? Well, the real issue here goes into the um, password policy, which is completely weak. So as we can see, we retrieve the ticket, and a threat actor could further um, crack this ticket and obtain the password. So if we have a strong password policy, this ticket will be completely useless for a threat actor if the threat actor could not be able to crack this ticket with a strong password. Also, as a recommendation for Kerberos thing, I'll recommend AES encryption for Kerberos tickets. So in here, if we go to the local group policy editor, and if we edit this security policy, we can identify the encryption types that are allowed for our Kerberos ticket. So AES encryption, it's always recommended. It's the strongest one. And here, to set a better password policy, here also in the domain controller policies, we can set up the maximum password age, enforce password history. This is important, so a user will not be able to constantly repeat passwords. And you know, in this case, my minimum password length is 7 characters. I'll say we can go more. We can enforce more characters. And if we go to Azure, we can enable password protection on Windows Server Active Directory. However, it is worth noting that this will require license P1 or P2, which usually has a cost. Now, going to LLMNR and NVTMS. So these are legacy name resolution protocols. What I mean with legacy, I mean with outdated. So how does this work? If the DNS fails, the LLMNR protocol comes. If this one fails, NVTNS will come. And they basically ask, like, who has this name? And any machine can reply. So in this case, a threat actor can sit in the middle of this conversation and act as a machine. And as a response of this, the domain controller will reply with the credentials, in this case with the hash. So obviously, this is an outdated protocol and a very insecure protocol. In this case, I've took a screenshot of how can you enable this vulnerability. So in this screenshot, you must need to do exactly opposite, completely opposite as I'm showing here. So in this case, turn off multicast name resolution. Yeah, in this case, we need to enable this to have a proper security for these protocols. Also, for advanced TCP/IP settings, we should disable net views over TCP/IP. For LAN manager authentication level, this is a security policy, so you need to change it in the root policy editor. We need to disable this, undefine this. And in this case, we need to enable to digitally sign communication always from server to client levels. Now, target Kerberos. This is an attack where an user can enforce Kerberosing to another user. This means that John.Peters could enforce Kerberosing over Maria.Clerk, and John.Peters could retrieve Maria's Kerberos ticket. This is done by having strong permissions over the users, for example, generic write or generic all. Now, how to detect this or how to mitigate this? In this case, it's not as easy as just setting up a CM tool and analyzing logs and expecting to retrieve a targeted Kerberos attack. This is more of correlating analysis with CMs and with Bloodhound. So Bloodhound is the tool that I currently used to map all the Active Directory permissions So in this case, we need to identify whose users have the strongest permissions over other users, and with this in mind, we can create a detection rule to identify event IDs. For example, this one, the 4769, which is the Kerberos service ticket request. So in this case, we need to have in mind which users have the strongest permissions over other users, and with this, we can use the SIEM tool to correlate the analysis and detect anomalies. A similar case happens with password abuse, where we also need to correlate the analysis from whose users have the strongest permissions, and with this we can create detection rules to identify event IDs. In this case, we have more event IDs, for example 4724, which is the password reset attempt, or permissions on object changed, account changes, or log on. We need to look for unique unusual patterns to identify these vulnerabilities. But yeah, that's all for today. That's all for this challenge. I hope you liked my explanation, and I hope I keep getting better at speaking, and one day probably I'll be able to speak without pauses and explain more clearly all these vulnerabilities. So thank you for your patience. See you in the next one.